75 years waiting for a throne, and his body chose exactly that moment to announce it had other plans. No modern king has arrived at power carrying this much at once: a crown, a diagnosis, a family fractured beyond easy repair, and the shadow of a death the world never fully forgave him for. And yet, those who know him best say he has never been happier. Not resigned, not merely functional. Happy. How does a man arrive at that? What did the longest wait in royal history teach someone no one prepared to be human, only to be king? To understand, we have to go back to the beginning. He arrived on the 14th of November, 1948, in a palace that bore his family's name. The flags went up. The cannons fired. The crowd gathered in the November cold outside Buckingham Palace with a kind of national relief that was almost physical. A kingdom exhaling after years of war, rationing, and grief. Welcoming the heir who would carry the line forward into whatever the future held. He was born into the most scrutinized family on earth. And he was, from the very first, profoundly alone in it. Queen Elizabeth II was 22 years old. She was not yet queen. That would come 3 years later, when her father died suddenly, and the weight of the crown descended without warning. But she was already a figure shaped by duty before sentiment, by obligation before softness. Biographers who spent decades studying her would describe her consistently in the same terms: warm in private moments, emotionally reserved by instinct and by training, a woman who had been formed by an institution that did not reward vulnerability. Prince Philip was 27. Brilliant, restless, sharp-edged in the way of men who have survived real deprivation and emerged from it with something to prove. He had lost his own family young. He had been sent away to school early. He had learned to survive by not needing, and he taught, consciously or not, the same lesson to his son. Charles was raised by nannies in the hours his parents were not present. He was presented to his mother and father at scheduled times, dressed and prepared, then returned to the nursery. This was not unusual for the aristocracy of that era. It was simply how things were done. But Charles was not simply aristocracy. He was the heir to a crown with 1,000 years of history pressing down on every meal, every school report, every carefully monitored childhood interaction. He was, by every external measure, given everything. He was, by the measure that perhaps matters most, given very little of what a child actually needs. The crown was his birthright. The loneliness was his inheritance. He was 8 years old when they sent him away. 8 years old. Small enough to still need reassurance at night. Old enough to understand, with the particular clarity that children have about such things, that being sent away means something, that it communicates something about how much your presence is required at home. Philip had chosen the school himself. Gordonstoun, on the northeastern coast of Scotland, carved out of the kind of landscape that does not apologize for its severity. Cold mornings, hard ground, an educational philosophy built on the conviction that discomfort is instructive and that boys become men by learning to endure. Philip had been sent there himself. It had made him who he was. He saw no reason his son should be spared the same shaping. What it made Philip, it nearly broke Charles. He would describe those years, in interviews given decades later, with a consistency that made it impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. He used words like miserable. He described the bullying with the flat precision of a man recounting facts rather than seeking sympathy. Other students mocking his ears, his accent, the particular target that royalty paints on a boy who is not permitted to fight back the way ordinary boys can. He was a prince, which meant he could not be common. And being uncommon, in a school that valued toughness above almost everything else, made him prey. What does an 8-year-old boy do with loneliness he cannot name, and grief he has not been taught to express? He reads, he paints, he turns inward, not from weakness, but because inward is the only place no one else can reach. Charles discovered literature at Gordonstown. He discovered music. He developed the interior life that would later make him seem strange to people who expected kings to be simpler, more decisive, less contemplative, less genuinely curious about the world's complexity. Those people were not entirely wrong to be surprised. What they were seeing was not eccentricity. It was the survival mechanism of a sensitive boy who had been dropped into a cold place and learned to generate his own warmth. He graduated. He went to Cambridge, became the first heir to the British throne to earn a university degree. He served in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. He performed every duty asked of him with the quiet, grinding reliability that would become his defining characteristic. Not brilliance, not charisma in the way his mother possessed it, but something that may actually be harder to sustain: constancy. He was made Prince of Wales in 1958, when he was 9 years old. He was formally invested in 1969 at 20, a ceremony watched by 500 million people around the world, conducted in a language, Welsh, that he had spent months learning out of respect for a nation that was not entirely convinced it wanted him. He did not complain. He prepared. He showed up. And then he waited. He waited while his mother reigned with a steadiness that seemed immune to time. He waited through his 30s, his 40s, his 50s, his 60s. He built causes, the environmental work, the architectural advocacy, the charitable foundations that people alternately admired and mocked. He wrote letters to government ministers that leaked and embarrassed him. He said things about modern architecture that made headlines for the wrong reasons. He was perpetually slightly out of step with whichever moment he was living in. Too traditional for the progressives, too unconventional for the traditionalists, too earnest for a culture that had learned to distrust sincerity. He waited through the marriage that defined him publicly. And that marriage, that particular, carefully arranged, historically consequential marriage, is where the story gets complicated in ways the palace never fully controlled. She was 19 years old when she walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. Diana Spencer, young enough to believe in the version of the story she had been told, inexperienced enough not to recognize the particular silence that surrounded Charles when certain names were mentioned, beautiful enough, and the world agreed on this instantly, unanimously, with the kind of collective certainty that borders on worship, to make the whole arrangement seem like something it was not. 750 million people watched the wedding on television. The streets of London were swollen with crowds who wept openly, who waved flags and threw flowers and allowed themselves, in the shadow of everything the previous decades had cost them, to believe in something uncomplicated for once. It was called the fairy tale of the century. But what happens when a fairy tale is built on the wrong foundation? The truth was quieter and considerably darker than the bunting suggested. Charles and Diana had met properly only 13 times before the engagement. The relationship had been orchestrated as much as it had been chosen. She was young, aristocratic, untouched by scandal, considered suitable by the machinery of an institution that measured suitability in bloodlines and public perception rather than in compatibility or genuine feeling. And Charles, by 1981, was already deeply bound to someone else. Camilla Parker Bowles had been part of his life since the early 1970s. Their relationship had been interrupted by his naval service and by Camilla's marriage to another man. But the connection had never fully severed. It was the kind of attachment that does not respond to practicality. Quiet, stubborn, surviving across years and circumstances, and the considerable pressure of an institution that found it inconvenient. He had not chosen Diana over Camilla. He had chosen duty over himself. And Diana, who was perceptive beneath the shyness and ferociously intelligent beneath the deference the palace expected of her, understood this almost immediately. What followed was not a marriage in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a performance of extraordinary technical skill, maintained for years at enormous personal cost to both participants, producing two sons who would themselves carry the fractures of it into their own lives. Charles was not cruel to Diana in the way that makes for simple villains. He was something more complicated, and, in some ways, harder to forgive. He was absent, not physically, present in the way duty demands, but the part of him that Diana needed, the warmth, the attention, the singular devotion that she craved with an intensity that alarmed people close to her. That part was never available. It had been given somewhere else, years before she arrived. The separation came in 1992, the divorce in 1996. And then, on the 31st of August, 1997, on a Paris road in the middle of the night, Diana died. She was 36. There is no clean way to describe what that death did to the public's relationship with Charles. The grief that erupted across Britain was not simply for Diana, though it was enormous, oceanic, unlike anything the country had witnessed. It was also, less consciously, a verdict. The crowds who gathered outside Kensington Palace, who left flowers until the flowers became a landscape unto themselves, were not only mourning a woman, they were expressing a judgment about the marriage, about the institution, about the man who had not loved her enough, and the crown that had demanded she be used as decoration for a dynasty she never fully belonged to. Charles did not defend himself publicly. He grieved. He arranged a funeral. He managed his sons with a gentleness that surprised people who had expected coldness, holding William and Harry's hands during the procession, shielding them from the worst of what was being said about their family in the press. But the damage was done. And here is something worth sitting with. The man who was judged most harshly by history for that marriage was also the man who had been told, from the age of 8, in cold dormitories on the Scottish coast, that what he felt was less important than what he performed. He had learned to suppress himself so completely, for so long, that when the suppression finally broke the surface in the form of Camilla, in the form of needing, for once, something that was actually his, the world called it betrayal. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was also the only honest thing he had done in years. He had been king for less than 16 months. 16 months! After 73 years of waiting, after Gordonstown and the Navy, and the architectural controversies and the letters to ministers and the fairy tale that wasn't, and the divorce and the death, and the long, grinding rehabilitation of a reputation that the public had decided, collectively, was guilty of something. After all of it, he had been on the throne for 16 months when his body sent the first signal. It began, as these things often do, with something that seemed manageable, an enlarged prostate, benign, a condition common enough among men his age that it barely warranted the kind of headlines it received, except that he was the King of England, which means nothing about his body is ever entirely private. In January of 2024, he checked into the London clinic for a corrective procedure. 3 nights. Routine, the palace said. Nothing alarming. But here is the thing about the body. It keeps its own counsel. During that procedure, during the investigation of something minor and expected, the doctors found something else. Something that was not minor. Something that was not expected. A cancer of undisclosed type and undisclosed stage, discovered almost by accident in the process of treating something else entirely. What would you feel in that moment if everything you had spent a lifetime preparing for had just arrived, and your body, your own body, chose precisely that moment to announce it had other plans? Buckingham Palace confirmed the diagnosis in February of 2024. The statement was careful, measured, calibrated in the way that only institutions with centuries of practice at managing public information can calibrate such things. The type of cancer was not revealed. The stage was not revealed. What was revealed was that treatment would begin immediately, and that the king would step back from public duties while that treatment was underway. The world absorbed this information with a particular kind of silence, not the silence of indifference, the silence of people who have spent years deciding how they feel about a man, building a verdict across decades of tabloid headlines and royal documentaries, and the long shadow of a marriage that ended in tragedy. And then finding, suddenly, that the verdict is harder to maintain than they expected. That something in them, something older than opinion, responds to the image of a 75-year-old man walking into a hospital to face a diagnosis alone. He was not alone, of course. Camilla was there. His staff was there. But in the way that matters, in the interior way, the way that no amount of institutional support can reach, he faced it the way he had faced everything since Gordon Stoun. By himself, with whatever he had built inside himself over 75 years to hold the weight. And then, and this is where the story becomes something beyond the merely dramatic, something that approaches the genuinely extraordinary. The phone rang, or the message arrived, or however it is that kings receive news they are not prepared for. And the news was this: Kate, his daughter-in-law, the Princess of Wales, William's wife, the mother of his grandchildren, George and Charlotte and Louis, the children who represent the continuation of everything he had waited his entire life to steward. Kate had cancer too. Diagnosed in February of 2024, announced publicly in a video that stopped the world in March of the same year. A cancer of undisclosed type, caught during abdominal surgery in January, treated with preventive chemotherapy through the spring and summer. Father and daughter-in-law. Same season, same palace, same disease. There is a word for what this is, but it is not a word that belongs in the language of royal announcements or press briefings. It is the word you use at 3 in the morning when the formalities have run out. It is simply unbearable. And yet, Charles said something in the midst of all this that has stayed with everyone who heard it. He said, "Early diagnosis quite simply saves lives. I know too what a difference it has made in my own case, enabling me to continue leading a full and active life even while undergoing treatment." He said, "I have been profoundly moved by what I can only call the community of care that surrounds every cancer patient." He said, "The darkest moments of illness can be illuminated by the greatest compassion." Read those sentences again. Not as royal statements, not as carefully worded press releases designed to project stability. Read them as what they actually are. The words of a man who has learned, across a lifetime of performing emotions he was not permitted to fully feel, how to say something true. The darkest moments of illness can be illuminated by the greatest compassion. That is not a man reading from a script. That is a man who has been in the dark, who knows what the dark actually looks like, who has found, somewhere in the community of doctors and nurses and fellow patients, and the wife who sat beside him, and the daughter-in-law who was fighting her own battle down the corridor, found something that surprised him, that he was not as alone as he had always believed. He returned to public duties at Easter of 2024, earlier than expected, moving carefully, but moving. The red boxes resumed. The audiences continued. The machinery of monarchy, which does not pause for illness any more than it pauses for grief, continued to demand what it had always demanded. He gave it what he had. But the family beneath the institution, the human architecture that is supposed to hold a king upright when the weight becomes too great, that family was broken in ways that a cancer diagnosis, however galvanizing, could not simply repair. And that fracture is a story all its own. Every dynasty has its fracture lines. Most of the time, those fractures are managed, contained, smoothed over by protocol and distance, and the shared understanding that the institution is larger than any single grievance, any single wound. The machinery keeps moving. The flags keep flying. The family smiles at the camera on Christmas morning, and the world accepts the image because the image is easier than the truth. But what happens when the fracture runs too deep for protocol to reach? What happens when the wound is not political but personal? Not a disagreement about duty, but a rupture in the most fundamental kind of trust. The trust between a father and a son? Harry left. That sentence, in its simplicity, contains a universe of pain that no memoir, no interview, no carefully curated Netflix documentary has fully mapped. Henry Charles Albert David, Duke of Sussex, younger son of the King, stood before the world in January of 2020 and announced that he and his wife Meghan were stepping back from their roles as senior royals. They were going to live differently, on their own terms, in a place, eventually California, where the machinery could not reach them. The world had opinions, it always does. But beneath the opinions, beneath the tabloid warfare, and the accusations and the counter-accusations, and the publication of Spare in January of 2023, a book that dropped like a grenade into the palace's careful silence, detonating revelations that Charles could not publicly answer without making everything worse. Beneath all of it was something much simpler and much more devastating. A father who could not reach his son. A son who felt he had not been protected. And between them, decades of an institution that had taught Charles, from the age of 8, that feelings are private and duty is public, that you do not break formation regardless of what it costs you internally. An institution that had shaped him so completely that even when his own child was in pain, he may not have had the language to respond in the way the moment required. Charles had learned to endure by not needing. Harry had needed. And the gap between those two realities, between a man formed by suppression and a son who refused to suppress, became, eventually, unbridgeable. Then came the cancer diagnosis in February of 2024. Harry flew from Los Angeles to London. The meeting was brief, private. The palace confirmed it happened. No one confirmed what was said. No reconciliation was announced. Harry returned to California. The distance remained. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine being the one who flies across an ocean, who sits in a room with your father, and the weight of everything that was said and everything that was left unsaid, and then walks back out into the world with no resolution, no roadmap, no clean ending? There is no villain in this story. That is what makes it so difficult to carry. There is a father who was taught that love is expressed through provision and presence, rather than through words. There is a son who needed the words. There is an institution that served as both the force that bound them and the wall that stood between them. There is grief, Diana's death, still unresolved beneath everything. A mother who never stopped being the fault line along which everything else eventually cracked. And then there is Andrew, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, second son of Elizabeth II, had always been Charles's problem in a different way. Not personal rupture, but institutional catastrophe. The interview Andrew gave to the British Broadcasting Corporation in November of 2019, attempting to address his association with the convicted trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, was one of the most damaging public performances by a senior royal in living memory. Not because of what he admitted, but because of what he did not admit. The manner, the extraordinary disconnection between the gravity of what was being discussed and the breezy confidence with which he discussed it. Charles watched that interview. He understood what it meant. By 2020, Andrew was gone from public duties, stripped of his military titles and royal patronages in 2022. A man who had been born into the highest possible privilege and had, through a combination of poor judgment and catastrophic arrogance, made himself untouchable. Charles inherited this too when the crown arrived. He inherited the Harry problem. He inherited the Andrew problem. He inherited a monarchy that had survived 1,000 years of war and plague and revolution and civil conflict, and was now being asked to survive the 21st century media environment, the attention economy, the particular mercilessness of a world in which every private wound is a public spectacle. He inherited all of it, and he was already carrying the cancer. Here is what Charles said in a video message broadcast on Channel 4 in December of 2025 about where things stood with his treatment. The doctors were reducing the intensity of what he was receiving. The early detection had made the difference. He was moving, cautiously, towards something that looked like the other side of it. And in May of 2026, 11 days before this story was written, he visited the Guy's Hospital Cancer Center in London. He stood in a ward surrounded by patients who were earlier in their own journeys. He talked to them. He listened. He told them, with the particular authority of a man who is not speaking theoretically, that the community of care surrounding every cancer patient is real. That the compassion of strangers in a hospital is one of the things that holds you upright when nothing else can. He also mentioned, almost in passing, the way people mention things that are actually enormous, that the chemotherapy had left a metallic taste in his mouth that made eating difficult. It doesn't exactly help with eating, he said. And somehow, in that small admission, that quiet, almost self-deprecating acknowledgement of something unglamorous and uncomfortable, something that has nothing to do with majesty and everything to do with simply being human, there was more dignity than in 1,000 formal proclamations. That evening, he attended a concert at the Royal Albert Hall celebrating the 50th anniversary of the King's Trust. He sat beside Camilla. He watched the performers. He was present, not despite everything, because of it. There is a question that follows a man like Charles through every room he enters now, not the questions about succession, or about Harry, or about whether the monarchy can survive the 21st century's particular appetite for dismantling the things it once revered. Those questions are real, but they are institutional. They belong to historians and constitutional scholars and the commentators who make their living measuring the distance between what the palace projects and what the public actually believes. The question that follows Charles is older and quieter than any of those. It is simply this: how? How does a man who was sent away at 8 years old and learned to need nothing, how does he arrive at 77 having lost a marriage, a daughter-in-law who died before she could be known fairly, a son who chose another continent over the same table? How does he arrive at that age, carrying a crown and a cancer simultaneously, and become, by every credible account, the most fulfilled version of himself he has ever been? The biographer, Jonathan Dimbleby, who has spent more time studying Charles than perhaps any other living writer, said something in 2026 that deserves to be held carefully. He said that Charles is the happiest he has ever been in the role of king, not despite the illness, not in spite of the fractures. Now, in this specific, complicated, medically uncertain, institutionally demanding present tense, how do you become happy in the ruins of everything that was supposed to make you happy? The answer, if there is one, seems to be, you stop performing happiness and start building it from whatever is actually there. What is actually there for Charles is Camilla. After decades of being the relationship the world refused to accept, the woman who was blamed for a fairy tale's failure, who was photographed and judged and reduced to a single narrative of destruction, Camilla became his queen. Not the queen the institution initially envisioned for him, the queen he chose, in the only genuine act of self-determination that his position had ever truly permitted. She sat beside him at the Royal Albert Hall on the 11th of May, 2026, while 50 years of the King's Trust were celebrated on the stage in front of them. She has sat beside him through the chemotherapy appointments and the red box nights and the quiet hours that no camera reaches. She is, by all evidence, the thing that held. What is also there is the work itself. Charles has read the red boxes every night of his reign without exception. He receives the briefings, signs the documents, hosts the audiences, makes the visits. He does this while being treated for cancer. He does this while managing a family whose fractures cannot be publicly acknowledged without making them worse. He does this because, whatever else can be said about him, the preparation was real. The 73 years of waiting were not wasted. He knew what the job was. He had spent his entire life learning it. And what is there, most unexpectedly, is the illness itself. Not as a gift, not in the facile way that people sometimes speak of suffering as though it were simply a different form of fortune, but as a clarifier, as the thing that burned away whatever remained of the performance and left only what was actually true. When Charles stands in a cancer ward, as he did 11 days ago at Guy's Hospital, as he has done repeatedly since his own diagnosis, he is not performing royal compassion. He is a man who knows what the metallic taste of chemotherapy feels like, who knows what it means to wonder in the quiet hours whether the body will cooperate with the plans the mind is still making, who has experienced firsthand the community of care he describes, the nurses, the doctors, the strangers in adjacent beds who become, briefly, the people who understand you most completely because they are in the same extraordinary, terrible place. The darkest moments of illness, he said, can be illuminated by the greatest compassion. He knows. And here is what this story ultimately asks you to consider. Not as a royal watcher, not as someone with a verdict already prepared, but as a person who has also been shaped by things they did not choose and asked to carry weight they did not request. What would it mean to spend 75 years preparing for the life you were given? And then discover, only after the crown arrived and the cancer followed, that the preparation was never really about the crown at all? That the 73 years of waiting taught him patience? That Gordon Stone, for all its cruelty, taught him endurance? That the marriage that broke publicly taught him, at enormous cost to everyone involved, what genuine connection actually requires? That Diana's death and the judgment it brought taught him the difference between reputation and character? That Harry's departure taught him the limits of an institution as a substitute for a father? that the cancer taught him is still teaching him that the body and the crown are both temporary, and that what remains after both are gone is something smaller and more essential. The question of whether you were present, whether you showed up, whether, in the rooms that mattered, you were actually there. At 77, King Charles III is still being treated. The treatment is moving into a precautionary phase. The early detection made the difference. He said so himself, in his own words, with the particular conviction of someone who is not speaking theoretically. He is still reading the boxes. He is still receiving the ministers and hosting the audiences and attending the concerts and visiting the hospitals. He is still here. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about a man whose entire life has been a study in what it costs to remain, to stay in the rooms that ask the most of you, to carry what cannot be put down, to show up for a role that was never designed with a human being's limitations in mind. He waited 75 years for the crown. He received it alongside a diagnosis that no one announces in advance. The crown fit. The body is still deciding. But the man, finally, after everything, is still standing. Do you believe that some people only discover who they truly are when everything that was supposed to define them is taken away? Leave your answer in the comments, because this question might matter more than you think. And if this story moved you, if something in Charles's journey resonated with something in your own, subscribe to Golden Fame News. Because next week, we are telling another story that history almost forgot to tell honestly.